Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode one, the first real episode of this series where I'm going to be looking at the phenomenology of spirit. And so, the way I kind of want this to work is that I'm going to read part of it and then I'm going to discuss it as soon as I finish, like, say, one paragraph of this sort, or in the case where there are like two paragraphs of this sort that are linked together, maybe I'll talk about them together. But I think again, I'll sort of we'll see how it goes. So I'll start by reading. It is customary to preface a work with an explanation of the author's aim, why he wrote the book, and the relationship in which he believes it to stand to other earlier or contemporary treatises on the same subject. In the case of a philosophical work, however, such an explanation seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of the subject matter, even inappropriate and misleading. For whatever might appropriately be said about philosophy in a preface, say a historical statement of the main drift and the point of view, the general content and results, a string of random assertions and assurances about the truth, none of this can be accepted as a way in which to expound philosophical truth. Also, since philosophy moves essentially in the element of universality, which includes within itself the particular, it might seem that here more than in any other of the sciences, the subject matter itself and even its complete nature were expressed in the aim and the final results, the execution being by contrast really the unessential factor. On the other hand, in the ordinary view of anatomy, for instance, say the knowledge of the parts of the body regarded as inanimate, we are quite sure that we do not yet as yet possess the subject matter itself, the content of this science, but must in addition exert ourselves to know the particulars. Further, in the case of such an aggregate of information, which has no right to bear the name of science, an opening talk about aim and other such generalities is usually conducted in the same historical and uncomprehending way in which the content itself, those nerves, muscles, etc., is spoken of. In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, this would give rise to the incongruity that, along with the employment of such a method and its inability to grasp the truth, would also be demonstrated. So, it is a mouthful, but this is one of the relatively easier passages to understand. What Hegel is basically trying to say here is that um, usually you try to add an aim at the beginning of a book, and he's going about explaining why he's not going to do that. And he says that that's because philosophy is shouldn't necessarily be tackled from a historical lens, but from the point of view of the subject matter. And again, he talks about the example of anatomy to illustrate that. So let's move on to the second paragraph. Furthermore, the very attempt to define how a philosophical work is supposed to be connected with other efforts to deal with the same subject matter drags in an extraneous concern, and what is really important for the cognition of the truth is obscured. A more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity. The more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be either accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. It does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as a progressive unfolding of truth, but rather it sees in it simple disagreements. The bud disappears in the bursting forth of the blossom, and one might say that the former is refuted by the latter. Similarly, when the fruit appears, the blossom is shown up in its turn as a false manifestation of the plant, and the fruit now emerges as the truth of it instead. These forms are not just distinguished from one another, they also supplant one another as mutually incompatible. Yet at the same time, their fluid nature makes them moments of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which each is as necessary as the other, and this mutual necessity alone constitutes the life of the whole. But he who rejects a philosophical system, i.e., the new philosopher, does not usually comprehend what he is doing in this way, and he who grasps the contradiction between them, i.e., the historian of philosophy, does not, as a general rule, know how to free it from its one sidedness or maintain it in its freedom by recognizing the reciprocally necessary moments that take shape as a conflict and seeming incompatibility. So, what Hegel is trying to say here is that we shouldn't constrain philosophical works to this idea of agreeing and disagreeing with each other, because the whole point of philosophy is that we're trying to get closer to the truth. And so a previous philosophical idea is not rendered obsolete by a new by a new philosophical idea. It's it's not even supplanted, like he said. It's the new idea is the combination of those two ideas. And here you kind of see the origins of Hegelian dialectic, because he's talking about how neither idea is perfect, and it's the unity of those ideas that results in the final truth, right? He says the more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity. But it's not about acceptance or rejection. It's about those philosophical systems working towards the progressive unfolding of the truth together. And so when he talks about the new philosopher and the historian of philosophy, because they're looking at it from um, either a non-nuanced lens, like that's the new philosopher, or a historical lens, they have the tendency to, according to Hegel, they have the tendency to portray these as two sides of an argument, whereas in reality, Hegel claims that it's they both have a common goal, and they have different ways of sort of approaching that goal, but both of these ideas don't contradict in essence because they build on top of each other in philosophy. So let me go to the next paragraph. Demanding and supplying these superficial explanations passes readily enough as a concern with what is essential. Where could the inner meaning of a philosophical work find fuller expression than in its aims and results? And how could these be more exactly known than by distinguishing them from everything else the age brings forth in this sphere? Yet when this activity is taken for more than the mere beginnings of cognition, when it is allowed to pass for actual cognition, then it should be reckoned as no more than a device for evading the real issue, a way of creating an impression of hard work and serious commitment to the problem, while actually sparing oneself both. For the real issue is not exhausted by stating it as an aim, but by carrying it out. Nor is the result the actual whole, but rather the result together with the process through which it came about. The aim by itself is a lifeless universal, just as the guiding tendency is a mere drive that as yet lacks an actual existence, and the bare result is the corpse which has left the guiding tendency behind it. Similarly, the specific difference of a thing is rather its limit. It is where the thing stops, or it is what the thing is not. This concern is with aim or results, with differentiating and passing judgment on various thinkers, is therefore an easier task than it might seem. For instead of getting involved in the real issue, this kind of activity is always beyond it. Instead of tarrying with it and losing itself in it, this kind of knowing is forever grasping at something new. It remains essentially preoccupied with itself instead of being preoccupied with the real issue and surrendering to it. To judge a thing that has substance and solid worth is quite easy. To comprehend it is much harder, and to blend judgment and comprehension in a definitive description is the hardest thing of all. So, again, Hegel goes back to the idea of why he's not defining an aim. He says that sort of to reach an actual, not necessarily to reach an actual conclusion, but to actually do something, you shouldn't just judge something and attach an aim to it, because if you attach an aim to it, you're not going to be able to get lost in the thing itself, and so you can't get carried away with the real issue. You're always trying to get to the end or the certain aim. And so by not defining an aim, Hegel is freeing himself from the responsibility to not the responsibility rather, but the 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 sort of forced impression to do something that the subject material doesn't deal with. And so he says that the the main purpose of this text is then to get lost in the subject material itself, and that is what is important. And he says that defining an aim is kind of lazy because it sort of leads you to judge a thing, and whereas he's trying to comprehend something, and if you comprehend something, you never know what you're going to come out with at the end of the day. And so yeah, and then he talks about blending the judgment and the comprehension. So I mean, of course, to judge something, you first have to comprehend it. And so that's what he's going about talking about in the third section. Culture in its laborious emergence from the immediacy of substantial life must always begin by getting acquainted with general principles and points of view, so as to first work up to a general conception of the real issue, as well as learning to support and refute the general conception with reasons, then to apprehend the rich and concrete abundance of life by differential classification, and finally to give accurate instruction and pass serious judgment upon it. From its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life in its concrete richness. This leads the way to an experience of the real issue. And even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by a serious speculative effect, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. So, what he's talking about here is the idea of culture coming from the acquaintance with general principles and a general idea of the real issue, and how that is fundamentally grounded in a classification of ideas. So he says a differential classification, and that is really important because that's how we pass judgment on something. And at the end of the day, what we're really doing when we're evaluating something is to a certain extent passing judgment on. We're either judging or comprehending, so just connecting that to the previous paragraph. And so again, he says when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effect, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. So let's move on to the fifth paragraph. The true shape in which truth exists can only be the scientific system of such truth. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title love of knowing and be actual knowing, that is what I have set myself to do. The inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in its nature, and only the systematic exposition of philosophy itself provides it. The external necessity, so far as it is grasped in a general way, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, is the same as the inner, or in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential existence of its moments. To show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science, and would therefore be the only true justification of any effort that has this aim, for to do so would demonstrate the necessity of this aim, would indeed at the same time be the accomplishing of it. So that last sentence is quite interesting because he talks about, so he says to show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science. This that would justify this effort. And so the effort he's referring to is bringing philosophy to science in some sense. He says to help bring philosophy closer to the form of science and be an actual system to get to know the truth. And so, yeah, that's the sort of essence of this paragraph. So, we are probably going to read a couple more paragraphs for today. Maybe till the end of page 5. So, number 6 starts with to lay down that the true shape of truth is scientific, or what is the same thing, to maintain that truth has only the notion as the element of its existence, seems, I know, to contradict a view which is in our time as prevalent as it is pretentious, and to go against what that view implies. Some explanation, therefore, seems called for, and even though it must for the present be no more than a bare assertion, like the view that it contradicts, if, namely, the true exists only in what, or better, as what, is sometimes called intuition, sometimes immediate knowledge of the absolute religion or being, not at the center of divine love, but the being of the divine love itself, then what is required is in the exposition of philosophy is, from this viewpoint, rather the opposite of the form of the notion. For the absolute is not supposed to be comprehended, it is to be felt and intuited. Not the notion of the absolute, but the feeling and intuition of it must govern what is said and must be expressed by it. So again, here he's talking about a kind of religious philosophy, because he talks about how the absolute, and in this case he's referring to religious absolute or supernatural absolute, is a contradiction to the scientific truth, because the scientific truth is about the notion and, I mean, as he talks about later, the sensuous experience, whereas the divine truth, or like the religious truth, is meant to be about intuition and about feeling. And yeah, so he says, for the absolute is not supposed to be comprehended, it is to be felt and intuited. And so he's making the argument that kind of uh, any sort of divine religious truth is not going to be rationally comprehended. So he says, if we apprehend a demand of this kind in its broader context and view it as it appears at the stage which self consciousness spirit has presently reached, it is clear that spirit has now got beyond the substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought, that it is beyond the immediacy of faith, beyond the satisfaction and security of the certainty that consciousness then had of its reconciliation with the essential being, and of that being's universal presence both within and without. It has not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of insubstantial reflection of itself into itself, but beyond that too. Spirit has not only lost its essential life, it is also conscious of this loss and of the finitude that is its own content. Turning away from the empty husks and confessing that it lies in wickedness, it reviles itself for so doing, and now demands from philosophy not so much knowledge of what it is, as a recovery through its agency of that lost sense of solid and substantial being. Philosophy is to meet this need, not by opening up the fact locked nature of the substance and raising this to self consciousness, not by bringing consciousness out of its chaos back to an order based on thought, nor to the simplicity of the notion, but rather by running together what thought has put asunder, by suppressing the differentiation of the notion and restoring the feeling of essential being. In short, by providing edification rather than insight. The beautiful, the holy, the eternal, religion, and love are the bait required to arouse the desire to bite, not the notion but ecstasy, not the cold march of necessity in the thing itself, but the ferment of enthusiasm. These are supposed to be what sustains and continually extends the wealth of substance. So, again, there's a lot to unpack here, but what Hegel starts by saying is that we're at a stage now, and by now he's of course referring to the 19th century when this book was written, but in like philosophical circles, that most people were sort of disillusioned with the idea of absolute faith, right? But where does that kind of leave them? Because he says that it has not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of insubstantial reflection of itself into itself, but beyond that too. Because it's not only lost that sort of essential, I don't want to say belief, because as he explains, it's not necessarily belief that the spirit requires, but he calls it life. It's lost its essential life, and it understands that it has lost this, and so it kind of yearns for something else. And he says that it demands from philosophy um, the the recovery of that solid and substantial being, and that's what he discusses. So he says that philosophy doesn't meet this need by bringing consciousness out of its chaos into like an irrational sort of thought based order, and neither does it bring nature to consciousness or um or something else. He says that the point of this philosophy is to provide edification rather than insight. So it's more than an idea, it's a structure, right? It's not like this philosophy is going to be the insight that connects this sort of lost self consciousness and spirit to the scientific philosophy, but it's the structure that will connect it. And yeah, he goes on to talk about that. Not the cold march of necessity in the thing itself, but the ferment of enthusiasm. And I think this will be the final paragraph for today. In keeping with this demand is the strenuous, almost overzealous and frenzied effort to tear men away from their preoccupations with the sensuous, from their ordinary private affairs, and to direct their gaze to the stars, as if they had forgotten all about the divine, and were ready like worms to content themselves with dirt and water. Formerly they had a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. The meaning of all that is hung on the thread of light by which it was linked to that heaven. Instead of dwelling in this world's presence, men looked beyond it, followed this thread into an otherworldly presence, so to speak. The eye of the spirit had to be forcibly turned and held fast to the things of this world, and it has taken a long time before the lucidity which only heavenly things used to have could penetrate the dullness and confusion in which the sense of worldly things was enveloped, and so make attention to the here and now as such, attention to what has been called experience, an interesting and valid enterprise. Now we seem to need just the opposite. Sense is so fast rooted in earthly things that it requires just as much force to raise it. The spirit shows itself as so impoverished that, like a wanderer in the desert craving for a mere mouthful of water, it seems to crave for its refreshment only the bare feelings of the divine in general. By the little which now satisfies spirit, we can measure the extent of its loss. So he talks about how, again, he begins with talking about how the spirit has lost that sort of that life that comes with faith. And yeah, so he says formerly they had a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery, but that's we've kind of lost that, right? If I mean, in the course of atheistic philosophy. And so what we need to sort of bring back, and he says it's a great loss, what we need to sort of bring back is uh, is what he's going to show through the course of this book, the connection between this inner spirit and the natural philosophy. And I think this is a good place to end because it kind of outlines where this book is going and what direction it's taking. So, thank you for listening and watching, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it made this book a little bit clearer. I know that this is taking a little while, but I think that it's good that we can stop and analyze everything. And if you enjoyed it, please post a comment. If you think my analysis was kind of off in places, which it probably was, then please leave a comment about that as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching.